Yat A. Yat A. Mark Charles Yinishya. Tsin Bakajanan Nishlin, do Tohiglini Bashachin. Tsin Bakajanan Bashache, do Tohichitni Bashanella. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always give your 4 clans. We're a matrilineal people. Our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is actually American of Dutch heritage. So when I introduce myself, I say Tsin Bakajanan Nishlin, which translated loosely means the wooden shoe people. My father's mother, my second clan, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that float together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todachitni, which is the Bitterwater clan, one of the original clans of our Navajo tribe. Before we start today, I just want to acknowledge that we are actually on the land of the Piscataway people. So the Piscataway tribe is a tribe that lived in this area. They were put onto reservations in the early 1600s, and they were ethnically cleansed from this land in the late 1600s and early 1700s. I say that because as a Native person, I like to acknowledge and understand whose land I'm walking on. And I also like to point it out in gatherings like this because we tend not to think about who was here before white settlers moved in. And so I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that we are sitting today on stolen land. And that has to be a part of the framing of our conversation. I want to start this dialogue, and every time I have these types of conversations, and I love the topic of evangelicalism and what's happening within the church and how are we going to move forward. But what I've learned over the years is that there is a history that both the church and the nation does not understand. And so before we can even have a conversation about what do we do, I really have to teach some history. Now in the next, and I have to warn you, they said we're going to run on a strict schedule, and they brought me up 10 minutes late. And I'm Native, and so I don't operate on a linear time perception. And so I am definitely going to go over the 20 minutes. I'm going to work hard to stay within the 35. I'm hoping that you will have at least 5 minutes at the end to reflect silently. But I felt, and I talked to Mary Kate and JR beforehand, that it was more important that we get this out because I really want what we talk about today to frame your entire discussion rather than we just have a discussion about what I'm saying right now. So I'm going to take more time to really try to convince you of some deeply inhaled implicit biases that you have that have a deep impact on your theology, on your missions, and on the church structures. So I have to warn you, I may call out a few organizations by name that some of you may have worked for or may currently work for. I may say some things that offend you or that cause you to want to stand up and walk out. Resist those impulses. Let's stay in the dialogue. I'm not picking on any one organization. I'm not trying to demonize any one organization. I'm trying to help us understand that if we don't address this specifically, and I've learned over the years, if I don't call things out by name, people tend to think, oh, we're not a part of that. We don't think that way. We don't do these things. So I'm not calling out organizations to demonize them or to mock them. I'm merely saying this is how implicit these biases are within us. So to start this dialogue, we really have to go back all the way to the teachings of Christ. So Jesus, when he came to this world, he had a huge challenge, which is his people, the Israelites, expected him to come as a political Messiah. They expected him to free them from their Roman oppressors, to restore the greatness of the kingdom of David, and to bring them back to this place of blessing in their promised land. And all throughout his ministry, Jesus was battling these expectations of he was not here as a political Messiah. He was born in a barn. He lived his life as a refugee. He came in these really meek and humble ways, but people didn't get it. And so even John the Baptist, who was championing his coming into this world, when he heard that Christ was out healing centurion servants and raising widows' children and healing the sick and caring for the poor, he even sent his own disciples to Jesus and said, are you the one we're looking for, or should we expect someone else? Jesus did more of the same, healed more, cast out more demons, set more people free, and said, go back and tell John what you saw. Blessed is the man who doesn't stumble on top of this. When Peter heard that his Messiah, his Savior, was going to be crucified, he took him aside and rebuked him and said, you don't have to do this. And Jesus said, no, and rebuked Peter. When Peter and James and John were walking out of Samaria and they had gone to the Samaritans to talk about Jesus and the Samaritans rejected them, they said, cool. Once God sends the prophet and the people reject the prophet, what does God do? Well, they asked Jesus, can we be the ones this time to call down fire from heaven and destroy them? And Jesus rebukes them. No, you can't do that. When he's before Pilate, he says, my kingdom is not of this earth. If it were, my servants, the angels, would come and set me free. My kingdom is not here. My kingdom is somewhere else. So in the early church, the 1st through 3rd century, you have the church and you have the empire completely separate. When you join the church through your baptism, your confession, your discipleship, and your community, you know that you're standing in opposition to the empire. You know there's a good chance you're going to be persecuted and probably even killed because of your membership in the church. Now, in the 4th century, Constantine becomes emperor of Rome. And he Christianizes Rome. He becomes a Christian while he's emperor, and he Christianizes Rome, creating a Christendom in direct contrast to what Jesus taught and modeled and planted. He creates a Christian empire. This fundamentally changes the understanding of the church. Now, instead of joining the church through your baptism, your confession, your discipleship, and your community, now you join the church through your membership in the empire. Well, this creates a problem because the empire does what empires do, which is it protects itself, expands its borders through the act of warfare. Except now you have Christian citizens fighting in those wars. Again, a plain text reading of Jesus' teaching doesn't allow that. So we need people like St. Augustine to come in and do some theological gymnastics to justify why the individual can be out fighting the wars of the Christian empire. Now, there's a consensus among a lot of scholars and writers that while Augustine acknowledged the Christendom, the Christian empire was not the city of God, he also kind of said, well, this is what we have, so we're going to try and make it work. We're going to try and see if we can make this Christian empire. It's not the ideal thing, but we're going to see if we can make it work. Over the next few centuries, the Crusades the just war theory morphs into what's called the Crusades. The Crusades are very explicitly about expanding the empire and protecting Jerusalem. And in the 11th century, we see in the writings of the papal bulls the introduction of this term called the infidel. The infidel is a subhuman category. It's primarily used in reference to the Moors or to the Muslims. Later, it's applied to indigenous peoples, anyone who doesn't worship the Christian God of the Europeans. Now that we have this category of infidel, now the justification for war begins to change. Now you don't need a just war theory. Now you're fighting your wars based on your theological grounds. You're fighting the other. So it's out of this that in the 1400s, 1452, Pope Nicholas V writes the words, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Convert them to his and their use and profit. This papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively become known as what we call the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by Christian rulers, those people are less than human, and the land's yours for the taking. This was quite literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the African people. They weren't believed to be fully human. This is the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was really lost at sea, land in this new world, already inhabited by millions, and claim to have discovered it. You can't discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your smartphones, your car keys, your wallets in front of you. I'll come by with Daniel and Donnie, 2 other native friends here, and we'll discover them for you. Clearly, it's not discovery. It's stealing, it's conquering, it's colonizing. The fact that to this day we have monuments and history books that teach that what Columbus did was discovery that reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is people of color, native peoples are not fully human. This makes the doctrine of discovery a systemically racist and dehumanizing doctrine that is the direct fruit of the church getting into bed with the empire. Believing there was such a thing as Christendom, believing we could theologically make this abomination work. as a church. The fruit of that is the doctrine of discovery. Now, the challenge is this doctrine has been embedded into the foundations of our country. So the Declaration of Independence, 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, refers to natives as merciless Indian savages. The Constitution, which begins with this term, we the people, a few lines later, Article 1, Section 2, where it defines who is and who is not covered by this Constitution, who is and not a part of this union. Article 1, Section 2, it never mentions women. It specifically excludes natives, and it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. We the people literally meant white landowning men. We don't ponder that enough. Today, women earn 70 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's working. Our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't shock us. The Constitution's working. 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and ruled that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals, creating an open door for super PACs and unlimited contributions to candidates. This should not shock us. The Constitution's doing exactly what it was designed to do, is protecting the interests of white landowning men. We tried to fix this. Congress passed the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. It doesn't abolish slavery. Slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. So it just redefined and codified slavery. It's now perfectly legal under the criminal justice system. When you look at our incarceration rates, we are off the charts compared to most nations around the world. 693 per 100,000 of our citizens are incarcerated in the US. 5 times in most other countries around the world. And when you break that out by color, by race, Hispanics, Latinos incarcerated 831 per 100,000, Native Americans 895 per 100,000, African Americans, black people 2,306. Whites are incarcerated rate of 450 per 100,000. The 14th Amendment, which was a direct response to Article 1, Section 2, extends the right of citizenship to anyone born on this continent under the jurisdiction of the government. Section 2 of this amendment still excludes women, still excludes natives, and it still bases the male citizenship based on the criminal justice system. So, and we can't forget, it was after this amendment that Jim Crow laws were written, boarding schools were opened, ethnic cleansing of natives happened, segregation took place, mass incarceration, internment camps. And in 1970, that very same amendment, the 14th Amendment, was used in Roe versus Wade, which now concluded unborn babies weren't human, and therefore they could be aborted. What this demonstrates is at the heart of the Constitution, there's not a value for life. The value is for exploitation and profit, and the practice is of dehumanization. This makes the Constitution of the United States a systemically racist and sexist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. 1823, we have a Supreme Court case, Johnson versus McIntosh. 2 men of European descent, they're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them gets the land from a native tribe, the other one gets the land from the government. They want to know who owns it. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The court had to decide the principle that land titles were based on. They determined that the principle for land titles was discovery, and then they referenced the doctrine of discovery as a legal instrument and concluded that natives, who were here first but are less than human, we only have the right of occupancy to land, like a fish would occupy water, a bird would occupy air, while Europeans have the right of discovery to the land and therefore the fee title, the true title to it. This case, by the Johnson Court, or the Marshall Court era, along with a few other cases, create the legal precedent for land titles. This precedent and the doctrine of discovery are referenced by the court 1954, 1985, and in 2005. This means to this day, the United States Supreme Court is a systemically racist court that has legal precedent based on the dehumanization of people of color. Now, initially, the Protestant church pushed back against the doctrine of discovery. This was the Catholic doctrine. They didn't fully buy into it. The Reformers, and we could go on to how the fertile ground of selection and election and predestination created this great fertile ground for a doctrine of discovery to grow and flourish. But in 1630, John Winthrop is in the Boston Harbor. and he preaches a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. In this sermon, he refers to the colonists. They're here to plant the Boston colony. He refers to them as a city on a hill. Now, he's borrowing from the image of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, be a lamp on a stand, a city on a hill, shining your good deeds into this dark world. He goes on in his sermon to exhort them in all patience, gentleness, liberality, mourn together, labor together, suffer together. He gives them basic Christian exhortations. The end of his sermon, he begins quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 30. He's trying to convince them to obey his command, and he's reading from Deuteronomy chapter 30. Now, Deuteronomy 30 is the passage in the Old Testament where the people of Israel are standing at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to cross over and take possession of their promised lands. And God is reiterating his threats and promises of his land covenant with them. If you obey me, I'll do these things for you. If you disobey me, I'll do these things to you. End of that passage, he says to them, but if our hearts shall turn away and we worship other gods and we will not obey, we shall surely perish out of this good land that we have crossed over this river to take possession of. Deuteronomy 30 says river. In his sermon, John Winthrop says vast sea. Why would he say vast sea? Well, they didn't cross the river, they crossed an ocean. So what's he implying? Based on the model of Old Testament Israel, based on the exhortation of Jesus to be a city on a hill, they are at the shores of their promised land, ready to take possession of them. Who here has read the book of Joshua? What's God's command to the people of Israel in the book of Joshua? Kill everybody. Leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. Promised lands for one people is literally God-ordained genocide for another. I call this sermon the birth of American exceptionalism. So that idea percolates for about 100 years. Mid-1700s, our nation begins moving past the Appalachian Mountains, past the Mississippi River. We begin expanding further and further west. End of the 1700s, the Second Great Awakening takes place. There's this growth in churches, a renewal of denominations. Early 1800s, the term manifest destiny is coined. This belief that this nation has the God-given right to rule these lands from sea to shining sea. This completely colors the way we think about, talk about, and teach the 19th century. We refer to the 19th century as our century of expansion. This is the century we added 30 new states to our union. Well, for almost 80 to 90% of the years of the 19th century, we were in a declared state of war against Native peoples. It was in the 19th century we passed the Indian Removal Act, which allowed for the Trail of Tears and the Long Walk for the Navajo. So in the 19th century, we started operating boarding schools. So in the 19th century, we had the massacre at Sand Creek, the massacre at Wounded Knee. All of these things as our nation is moving further. It's not a century of expansion. This is a century of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Now, all of this has huge implications upon the way the church thinks and operates, how it does its theology, how it does its missions, how it does its church structure. All of these are influenced by this history that we never talk about. So there is a lived theology among the church that you are living on your promised lands. This is your promised lands. It's so clear that a year and a half ago when Benjamin Netanyahu was here in the U.S. to lobby against the Iran nuclear deal. And he had a joint speech to a joint session of our Congress. He was talking to a very divided, a very partisan Congress. He had to get everyone on the same page behind him. Beginning of a speech, he says to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. To applause. To applause. How many churches, if I were to call them to repent for the sin of slavery, the sin of ethnic cleansing and genocide, would not look for some sort of hope? Because if you're going to lament these deep sins, lament these deep transgressions, you need to have some sort of hope at the light at the end of the tunnel, correct? Well, how many of our churches, if they were trying to confess and look for hope out of confessing these deep historic sins, would not look for their hope in the book of Colossians, where God says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, I will hear from heaven I will forgive their sins, and I will what? Heal their land. This is God reiterating the land covenant with the people of Israel at the second dedication of the temple. Those words don't apply to Americans. Believe it or not, you are not God's chosen people. And this is not your promised land. There's nothing in Scripture that says if America or the American church confesses its sins, that God is going to heal its land. Who of you, if your child stole a bike, came to you, Mom, Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa, I stole this bike, I feel horrible about it. Who lets them keep the bike?
Wow.
There is nothing in Scripture that says if God's people in America confess their sin, He's going to heal their land. But this is the way we think about it. And this isn't a partisan issue. So a few years ago, when there was a bipartisan bill on the table in front of Congress for immigration reform, the Gang of Eight brought a bipartisan bill. There is a group called the Evangelical Immigration Table, which was championing, lobbying for this bill, trying to get it passed. They came out with a bookmark that had 40 verses on them that they said demonstrated God's heart for the alien. 26 of their verses came from the Old Testament, 14 came from the New. Many from the Old Testament said things like, remember you used to be aliens in Egypt, implying now you're in your promised lands. One of their verses was from... let me pull it up here. One of their verses was from, I usually have it on the tip of my tongue here. Jeremiah 7, verses 5, 6, and 7. Jeremiah 7, verses 5 and 6 say, if you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, all of these are good commands, I exhort you to obey them. But they included verse 7. Verse 7 says, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your ancestors forever and ever. I went to the Evangelical Immigration Table. I said, you can't use this verse. You are not God's chosen people. This is not your promised land. You cannot use God's land covenant as a way to motivate your people to obey the commands of God. This is part of the implicit bias, the lived theology of the evangelical church in America. This is the lived theology of the nation. This is the way we think. This is the way the Church of America goes to sleep at night. Why we don't ask who used to live here, because we have this deep-seated belief that we are God's chosen people. This is our promised land, and when you have promised land, your genocide is justified. And while not most people don't absolutely teach this from their pulpits, this is the way Americans go to sleep at night. This is why most people in this room probably didn't know the Piscataway people used to live here and were ethnically cleansed from here, because you don't have to ask those questions when you have promised lands. That's not very important. The second lived theology that we have is this theology of the infidel, the other, the dehumanizing of the unknown. This is what we do as a nation, as a church. This is why America doesn't torture. It's not that we don't torture. Come on, we torture. Terrorists aren't human. This is the way we think. Why is the church so adamant against the LGBTQ community? They've otherized them. Who is the most compassionate about gay marriage and the LGBT community in the church? People who have family members who are gay. Why? The other became human. Dick Cheney, one of the most conservative vice presidents we've had in a long time, stood with George Bush on every single issue except one, gay marriage. Why? He has a gay daughter. Couldn't otherize them anymore. If the egregious example of the doctrine of discovery and the theology of the infidel is what we did in this nation historically, the passive-aggressive version of it is a church that sends out missionaries not to bring the gospel, but to humanize the subhumans through their charity, through their education, through their cultural assimilation, to humanize these subhumans around the world. And don't tell me you don't do it, because I see it every summer on our reservation. Team after team after team after team don't give a crap about who we are. Don't even need to know our names. Just want to take our pictures. Save the same 5 kids over and over and over at every summer camp. This is what we do. This is the lived theology of the infidel. We dehumanize those that we don't understand or know or see, and out of our charity, we go out to humanize them. But when they stand in our way out of our oppression, we actually destroy them and feel no guilt about it. This is the way we think. This issue of promised lands. Today, if the tribe, Piscataway people, were to come back and sue D.C., Alexandria, Maryland for their land back, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, the court wouldn't say, well, look, we have a treaty with you, because that treaty was broken. The court wouldn't say you're a conquered people. The court would say, 1823, according to the doctrine of discovery, you're not fully human. You only have aboriginal title to the land, while Europeans have fee title to the land. Therefore, the United States government is the true title holder of this land. If you own a house and you follow your title to your land back far enough, it will eventually get to the point of the government claiming the right of discovery over the people of that land. We all, as Americans, if you have never thought about your land title that your church or your house reside on, you have bought into this narrative. I was at Standing Rock. At Standing Rock, there was one day where several churches, religious leaders, came together and they repudiated the doctrine of discovery. There were pictures all over social media. It was a big thing. There were hundreds, even thousands of people there. I met with one of the people who organized this event. And I said, so this is interesting. I said, I'm glad you guys did that. It's important to do. I'm curious, did you give any land back? And he said, no, we didn't have the authority to do that. I said, okay, well, the doctrine of discovery is a legal instrument used by the Supreme Court to justify land titles. Did you commit that if a tribe comes back to your denomination and sues for land back that you own, you commit not to defend yourself in court? He said, no, we didn't do that either. I said, so basically then this was just a photo op. That's basically what this was, correct? He said, yeah, that's what it was. We don't know what to do with these things. And so a lot of evangelicals now are saying, what happened to the church? Look, we elected Donald Trump. What's going wrong with the church? And I'm like, I would never vote for him and I don't support him, but he actually made my job a whole lot easier. Because he helped people become convinced we have some serious problems. This last election, the challenge with Donald Trump is he actually gets what made America great, which is explicit and systemic racism and sexism. And he campaigned to bring that back. Now, the challenge is Hillary was not his antithesis. So Donald said, make America great again. What did Hillary say? America's always been great. America's great because we're good. At the Democratic National Convention, President Obama jumped into the fray and said, America's great already. Cory Booker, an African-American senator from New Jersey. He's endorsing Hillary Clinton from the main stage of the Democratic National Convention. In his speech, he acknowledges the word savages in the Declaration. He acknowledges that women and natives are excluded from the Constitution, and he acknowledges the Three-Fifths Compromise. He ends that section of his speech by saying, but these things do not detract from our nation's greatness. Like, that's like clinging to a life preserver after the Titanic sank and said, you know, that was a good ship. This is the implicit. So our candidates agreed. Our history, our past, our foundations are great. This is the way we think. So we have to ask the question, what happened to the church? I want to end with this. I want a short critique of why we elected Donald Trump. Donald Trump campaigned on basically 3 issues to Christians: Supreme Court and pro-life, religious liberty, and support for Israel. Those were his 3 campaign pledges to Christians. So I want to deal with all 3 of them. First, let's deal with Supreme Court and pro-life. So in college, I actually gave a pro-life speech. I was at UCLA. I gave what I thought was a pro-life speech. And after the speech, when the class was critiquing me, they chewed me up and spit me out. They said, your speech advocated against abortion. You represented no value for the life of the child after it was born. Your speech gave no value to the woman who was in the situation who needed the abortion. And your speech in wanting to defund Planned Parenthood showed no value for the whole of women's health care. They said, you're not pro-life, you're pro-issue. You're against abortion, but you're not pro-life. And I went back and I looked at myself, I looked at the church, and I realized they're right. We're not pro-life. If you can't say Black Lives Matter, you're not pro-life. The church, by and large, is not pro-life. So we have to just be clear. Donald Trump, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, is not pro-life. Maybe on every Tuesday of a month ending in Y, he might be pro-issue. But you do not talk about immigrants and refugees. You do not treat women the way he does. You do not talk about people of color the way he does if you have a comprehensive pro-life value. Donald Trump is not pro-life. Second issue, religious liberty. One of the big issues about religious liberty is prayer in schools. How many Christians have you heard lament, oh, remember we used to pray in schools? We need religious liberty back to pray in our schools again. How would these people feel if their 5 to 7-year-old daughter or son came home and said, Mom, Dad, guess what? We had a Muslim call to prayer in school today. They'd be appalled. They don't want religious liberty, they want Christian liberty. They want the right to subjugate other people to their faith, but they don't want themselves to be subjugated to the faith of other people. And so when you look at the teachings of Jesus, what does he say about Christian liberty? What does he tell his disciples? You're going to be persecuted. Your families are going to abandon you. You're going to die. But I'm going to use that persecution to further my kingdom. If you want Christian liberty, you are in the absolute wrong religion. There is no such thing as Christian liberty. Now, how about support for Israel? Well, the U.S. and the nation-state of Israel have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship that is completely wrapped up around this reappropriation of promised lands. The nation-state of it, we need Old Testament Israel's story. We need the nation-state of Israel's Old Testament legacy to justify our history of genocide and ethnic cleansing and slavery of people and of native peoples. And the modern nation-state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify their current oppression against Palestinians and Bedouins. We have a very dysfunctional, codependent relationship with the nation-state of Israel, and it's wrapped up around this misappropriation of promised lands. And that's the way President Trump campaigned to the Christian right. And 81% of white evangelicals voted for him. 60% of white Catholics voted for him. All of these things have deep, deep impact on the way we do mission, on the way we think about theology, and on the way we structure our churches. And if we don't get how we are complicit in this history, we're never going to be able to address it. If we keep thinking this is that organization, this is that organization, this is that organization. I am a member of the Christian Reformed Church. In 1860s, early 1860s, the U.S. government sent Kit Carson through the Navajo lands, and he burned all the crops, killed all the animals, and destroyed all the homes. They waited people out, and in winter they said, turn yourselves in, and they marched us down to Fort Sumner, where they tried to house us there. It was a horrible piece of land. Many of our people died. And in 1868, we negotiated a treaty to come back. In the early 1900s, the Christian Reformed Church bought a piece of land on that area that was ethnically cleansed, and they called it Rehoboth. Rehoboth comes from the book of Genesis that says, God has given us room, and we shall flourish in the land. They went on to open a boarding school. The purpose of the boarding school, of all boarding schools, was to kill the Indian to save the man. This is what the church does. This isn't just the Christian Reformed Church. Presbyterians, Catholics, many churches opened boarding schools. They stayed in operation until the 1970s and 80s. This is the challenge is not it's what's happening to the church today. It's what's been wrong with the church since Constantine. The pivot. When Constantine defies Jesus and creates Christendom, and then the church fathers, the theological thinkers, St. Augustine comes around and he doesn't reject the notion of a Christian empire. He acknowledges it's not the city of God, but he says, let's try and work with it. The challenge we have as the church in America is, depending on your political leanings, you are either a lobbyist or an activist in the public space. During the Obama administration, much of the left-leaning, socially justice active church became lobbyists to the Obama administration, while the conservatives were activists against them. And now with Trump in office, it's the exact opposite. Sojourners and CCDA and other organizations are actively activists against Trump, and the rest of the church is lobbying him. There's no such thing as a Christian empire. It doesn't exist. We don't need to be activists or lobbyists. We need to be prophetic. We need to speak truth to power. We don't cozy up with power. We don't try to get close to them. We speak truth to power. And until we are able to get back to that place, we're not going to be able to do it. I want to end with one final thought, which is the thought of all of this. What do we do with all of this? I'm writing a book with a friend, Soong-Chan Rah. He just published a book called A Prophetic Lament. He calls the church into a space of lament. One of the ways he describes lament, a characteristic of lament, he says, is it's like being at a funeral dirge. There's a dead body in the casket. It's not going to come back to life. The only thing you can do is mourn. The only thing you can do is weep. The church in America, when you believe in your own exceptionalism, there's no space to lament. So we have a song of lament. We have a service of lament if we're really radical. We need to go into a season of lament. We have 500 years of dead bodies in caskets. We can't bring them back to life. We have to find a way to lament these things, and that is the place I'm trying to call the church. I have two messages for the church right now. My first prayer for the church is that God will raise up prophets to rebuke the church. My second prayer is that God will prune the church. Prune the church. The prophets can't prune it. God prunes it. It's his church. It's his bride. I want to see God prune his church. Not just because of the last election, because of the last 2,000 years and the impact that's had on the church and on my people. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.